How close is the world to a major Middle East war? Closer than the ceasefire suggests. A 2-week ceasefire has alleviated the immediate danger, but the underlying situation is more dire. The Middle East is now ensnared in a system of escalation, where shipping lanes, proxy networks, nuclear pressure, and domestic politics can still draw multiple countries into a broader conflict. And domestic politics can still pull multiple countries into a wider war. The world has stepped back from the edge, but not by much. The immediate answer is this: the world does not appear to be on the brink of a clean, formal, all-sides regional war today, on April 8, 2026. A 2-week ceasefire between the United States and Iran, brokered with Pakistani mediation and tied to reopening the Strait of Hormuz, has lowered the short-term risk of an even bigger military explosion. But that is only the surface reading. The region is still very close to a larger conflict because the main causes of this crisis, nuclear tensions, Israel's fears, Iran's response strategies, proxy wars, key energy routes and local political pressures are still there. They have just been put. They have merely been paused. That matters because ceasefires in this kind of confrontation are not the same thing as settlements. The current truce is conditional, narrow, and already surrounded by distrust. Reuters and AP both report that fighting and alerts continued around the region even as the deal was announced, while Iran has framed the pause as something far short of the end of the war. In plain English, the temperature has dropped, but the fire is still in the walls. The more honest big-picture answer, then, is neither the world is on the verge of World War III nor the crisis is over. It is the truth. The Middle East is now in a high-volatility escalation system where one strike, one shipping incident, one assassination, one proxy attack, or one collapsed negotiation could drag several actors back into intense conflict rapidly. That is a more serious and more useful warning than either panic or complacency. Why this crisis feels bigger than a normal round of fighting. This war feels bigger because it is bigger. It is not just another exchange between Israel and an Iranian-backed militia, or another Gulf shipping scare, or another nuclear standoff in isolation. It is several old Middle East fault lines fusing at the same time: Israel versus Iran, Washington versus Tehran, Gulf security versus maritime coercion, and nuclear diplomacy versus military preemption. That overlap is what makes the risk so dangerous. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of that danger. The U.S. Energy Information Administration says roughly a fifth of global oil supply passes through the strait, and its latest outlook notes that the waterway has been effectively closed to normal traffic during the conflict, contributing to sharp oil volatility. Reuters reports that reopening Hormuz became the central condition of the ceasefire itself. When a war's core bargaining chip is one of the most important energy choke points on Earth, the crisis is no longer just a regional consequence, even if it remains regional in geography. That is why financial markets, central banks, import-dependent states, and shipping firms are all watching the situation so closely. CFR has described the war's fallout as a geo-economic firestorm, and Reuters has reported that major financial institutions have already marked down expectations because of the conflict's inflationary and energy market effects. A major Middle East war is not just a military event. It is an oil shock, an inflation shock, a shipping shock, and a political shock all at once. The real question is not, will there be war? It is, how wide can it spread? This is the point many people miss. There is already war. The better question is how far it spreads, how many fronts it activates, and whether outside powers become harder to keep out. Since the war began on February 28th, the United States and Israel have struck Iran. Iran has retaliated against Israel and U.S. Gulf bases, and the conflict has disrupted regional stability and global energy flows. AP reports that Lebanese casualties have mounted, and missile alerts have continued across parts of the region, even amid the ceasefire. In other words, this is already a multi-theater conflict. The debate is about scale, not existence. CSIS captures the logic. Well, Iran has shifted from more calibrated retaliation to broader horizontal and vertical escalation, meaning it has widened the geography of conflict and expanded the types of targets at risk. That matters because once escalation becomes horizontal, the map itself becomes unstable. A crisis that begins around Iran and Israel does not neatly stay there. It starts touching Gulf infrastructure, Lebanese battlefields, Red Sea routes, and US military positions. So the real danger is not one dramatic movie-style moment where every state suddenly declares war. The real danger is a grinding expansion in which more and more actors are functionally dragged in: Hezbollah, the Houthis, Gulf states under pressure, American forces already present in the region, and global powers trying to prevent oil and shipping chaos. That is how regional wars often become major, not through one ceremony, but through cumulative entanglement. The nuclear issue still sits under everything. The nuclear issue underpins the military crisis, making it impossible to comprehend. CFR's latest conflict tracker says Israeli officials continue to frame Iran's nuclear efforts as an existential threat that could fundamentally alter the regional balance of power. That is not just rhetoric. It explains why this confrontation feels harder to stabilize than a normal border flare-up or proxy exchange. If one side believes time is working in the other side's favor, diplomatic pauses become less reassuring. The IAEA's February 27, 2026 Safeguards Report and related March Board statement show why the nuclear file remains so combustible. The agency says it still cannot provide assurance that there has been no diversion of nuclear material and no undeclared nuclear activity at certain Iranian facilities, even while Iran has continued to facilitate some access. That combination, partial cooperation, incomplete confidence, and a live war environment, is precisely the kind of ambiguity that keeps military risk elevated. And now, the current diplomacy appears to contain fresh ambiguity. AP reports that Iran's Farsi version of the ceasefire proposal included acceptance of enrichment language, which is not reflected in the English version. Whether that proves decisive or not, it tells you something important. The diplomatic text itself may not mean the same thing to all parties. In a nuclear-linked crisis, that is dangerous. Why the ceasefire is real, and why it may still be fragile. It would be wrong to dismiss the ceasefire as meaningless. It is meaningful precisely because the region had been so close to an even bigger escalation. Reuters reports that President Trump had threatened far more extensive attacks before reversing course and agreeing to a 2-week suspension tied to Hormuz reopening and further talks. This represents a significant reduction from a potentially more perilous immediate threshold, but it would be equally wrong to mistake the pause for stability. Iran has set preconditions for lasting peace that include cessation of strikes, guarantees against renewed attacks, and compensation, according to Reuters. These are not minor details to resolve at the margins. They represent fundamental issues of war termination, deterrence, and sovereignty. If the parties cannot bridge them, the pause risks becoming a tactical intermission rather than a pathway to peace. Hormuz itself remains a source of instability even inside the pause. Reuters reports that Iran is proposing fees for transit through the strait as part of a broader deal, while legal and diplomatic objections remain fierce. This is significant because if the choke point not only reopens but also becomes politically weaponized, the core coercive structure of the crisis endures. A shipping lane under conditional pressure is not the same as a shipping lane returned to normal. What media misses? The greatest mistake in a crisis like this is to think only in terms of war versus peace. That is too binary. The more realistic danger zone is the vast territory in between: partial ceasefires, unofficial retaliation, proxy strikes, cyber operations, maritime coercion, sabotage, sanctions warfare, and periodic air attacks. CSIS has explicitly warned that even when the current war's peak phase ends, Israel and Iran may continue in a lower level but persistent conflict involving cyber attacks, sabotage, terrorism, and occasional overt strikes. That kind of environment can last for months or years, and it can still kill many people, destabilize governments, and shock the world economy. In other words, the question, are we about to see one giant regional war, can actually obscure the more likely and more enduring danger: a semi-contained but repeatedly reigniting confrontation that remains permanently capable of becoming bigger. That is not a comforting answer. It is a sharper one. The shipping story is really a global power story. One reason this crisis matters so much is that the shipping story is not just about oil tankers. It is about leverage. The Strait of Hormuz is important because it provides Iran asymmetric power over a much larger global system. Tehran cannot outmatch the United States conventionally. It does not need to. By threatening or constraining a route that carries vast volumes of oil and gas, it can transmit pain outward into Asian import markets, Western inflation, insurance costs, shipping schedules, and political decision-making in other capitals. This is why the Strait continues to be a focal point in events. And this is where outside powers matter. Reuters and AP both report that Pakistan played a major mediating role in this ceasefire, while AP says China quietly helped facilitate Iran's acceptance. That is a reminder that once the crisis touches shipping, energy, and financial stability, it ceases to be a purely local contest. Other states may avoid entering the war militarily, but they will try to shape its outcome because the costs of inaction are too high. The involvement of external parties is a complex issue. It can support de-escalation, but it also means the conflict is tied into broader strategic rivalries and diplomatic bargaining, which can make simple settlements harder. The proxy network still makes a wider war plausible. Even if Washington and Tehran avoid direct large-scale escalation for now, the proxy architecture remains a major source of risk. AP reports that Hezbollah has also joined the current ceasefire framework, highlighting the interconnectedness of the fronts. CSIS has warned that Iran could expand the conflict further by leaning on allied groups and threatening other maritime choke points such as Bab el-Mandeb via the Houthis. Once those channels are active, controlling escalation becomes far harder because states are not the only actors moving pieces on the board. That matters because proxy networks create deniability, delay, and confusion. A missile, drone, or maritime attack can occur in a gray zone of responsibility, giving leaders room to escalate while publicly pretending they are merely responding. This ambiguity is one reason Middle East crises can spiral. Attribution is messy, signaling is noisy, and domestic audiences often punish restraint more than risk-taking. The existence of a ceasefire at the top does not automatically disable the trigger points lower down. The human cost already shows how serious this is. Any big-picture explainer that focuses only on strategy and oil misses the human reality. Reuters reports that the conflict has caused significant casualties and displacement. Another Reuters dispatch says the 6-week war has caused more than 5,000 deaths, including more than 1,600 Iranian civilians. AP separately reports nearly 2,000 Iranians and over 1,500 Lebanese killed since the war's onset, while Washington Post, reporting from inside Iran, describes widespread fear, infrastructure destruction, and deepening civilian exhaustion. Exact numbers vary across outlets, but the common point is unmistakable. This is already a major human disaster, even before any hypothetical wider war arrives. That matters strategically too. Civilian suffering hardens politics. It narrows leaders' room to compromise, increases pressure for revenge, and makes every new strike more likely to be interpreted as proof that the other side only understands force. Wars rarely become easier to end once societies have absorbed this level of pain. What happens next? The most likely next phase is not immediate total regional war. It is a tense diplomatic window in which all sides test whether they can lock in limited gains without surrendering core demands. Talks are expected in Islamabad, and the key early indicators will be whether Hormuz traffic normalizes, whether Israeli and Iranian strikes genuinely stop, and whether the nuclear question is being papered over or seriously addressed. The most dangerous next phase is a collapse of the pause triggered by either a disputed violation or impossible demands. If one side concludes that the other is using talks to regroup, bluff, or quietly improve its position, then the logic of preemption returns very fast. In a system already built around distrust, deadlines, and coercion, failed diplomacy can be more explosive than no diplomacy at all. The most underestimated next phase is the war after the war scenario. No formal regional conflagration, but a long campaign of cyber attacks, covert action, intermittent strikes, proxy pressure, and shipping coercion. CSIS has explicitly flagged that possibility. From a global perspective, that kind of semi-permanent instability may matter more than one dramatic week of headlines because it keeps the region chronically one shock away from another crisis. So, how close is the world really? Close enough that nobody serious should be relaxed, but not so close that catastrophe is inevitable. This is the optimal equilibrium. The current ceasefire means the world has stepped back from the most immediate cliff edge. However, the underlying issues of the crisis still indicate risks. Ongoing nuclear doubts, a shaky agreement in Hormuz, armed groups that could escalate the conflict, leaders feeling the need to appear strong, and an energy system that spreads every disturbance well beyond the area. The blunt answer is that the Middle East is probably not 1 minute away from a single apocalyptic all-to-out war today, but it is absolutely still living inside its architecture. And that may be the more unsettling truth, because architecture lasts longer than headlines. A ceasefire can pause the bombs. It cannot, by itself, dismantle the system that keeps making them likely.